Ferrari's telemetry stream froze exactly 31 minutes after the Singapore Grand Prix, and for John Elkann, that silence spoke louder than any headline. On the primary monitor inside Maranello's command room, a single figure flashed in red: 300 points. That was Ferrari's total after 16 races. A devastating statistic for a season meant to restore the Scuderia's pride. Yet buried within that same data packet lay an even harsher truth: an energy deployment deficit of 0.42 seconds per lap compared with McLaren, enough to erase every advantage built through winter testing. Within hours, Elkann summoned Chief Executive Officer Benedetto Vigna for a midnight emergency meeting. What began as a technical review ended as a reckoning. If this continues, Elkann warned, we change everything. And by everything, he did not mean wings or floors, he meant leadership. Because that night, as engineers searched for power loss, Elkann searched for a replacement, one name glowing on his tablet: Christian Horner. Ferrari's decline did not begin with emotion, it began with arithmetic. 5 consecutive races without a podium, an average race pace deficit of 0.36 seconds per lap to McLaren. Tyre degradation rising 8% faster than Mercedes under comparable track conditions. For a team boasting a wind tunnel correlation of 97%, those figures were catastrophic. Internal performance audits revealed that 82 championship points had been lost to strategic misjudgment alone: pit stop windows missed, undercuts aborted, tyre calls reversed. Fred Vasseur's command structure, once celebrated for precision, had eroded into hesitation. In Singapore, Lewis Hamilton finished 8th after a 5-second penalty, while Charles Leclerc managed only 7th, both losing 0.2 of a second in Sector 3 due to overheating rear compounds. Engineers argued whether undersized cooling ducts or flawed aerobalance mapping were to blame, but neither diagnosis addressed the core issue. Ferrari's degradation curve collapsed beyond lap 43, turning pace into panic. By Monday morning, Elkann's patience had expired. He convened what insiders later called the red light meeting, ordering every department head to deliver a recovery plan or an exit timeline. Those words, exit timeline, sent a chill through Maranello. For decades, Ferrari's foundation had been loyalty, now it was fear. And in that silence, a single whisper cut through the tension: Christian Horner. The name carried more gravity than any lap time delta. The architect of 8 driver titles and 6 constructor crowns symbolized control, not chaos, a reminder that dominance could be designed. By dawn, Elkann no longer questioned whether leadership was the problem. He questioned how quickly it could be replaced. The crisis had evolved from mechanical to existential, and Ferrari's once sacred chain of command was now just another variable in a losing equation. By Tuesday morning, the hallways of Maranello no longer sounded like a racing factory. They sounded like a corporation in denial. Department heads shuffled between meetings, updates were whispered rather than announced, and the confidence that once defined Fred Vasseur's leadership had thinned to paper. Inside the glass-walled conference room above the assembly line, John Elkann listened to a debrief that felt more like an autopsy. 3 planned power unit upgrades had failed to produce the promised 12-kilowatt efficiency gain, and 2 aerodynamic concepts had consumed €9.4 million in computational fluid dynamics modelling and wind tunnel hours for only 0.06 seconds of simulated lap time improvement. Vasseur defended those results with spreadsheets and context, but data without direction convinced no one. Ferrari had become risk-averse, a culture of protection rather than progression, where engineers shielded statistics instead of chasing speed. Elkann saw it plainly. The team had plenty of managers, but no leadership. And then came the whisper that changed everything. Christian Horner was free. After guiding Red Bull to 8 driver championships and 6 constructors' titles, Horner's reputation embodied process, discipline, and the absence of panic. To Elkann, he was the antidote to Ferrari's emotional turbulence. As the meeting ended, Elkann turned to Vigna and delivered 3 quiet words that carried the weight of revolution. Evaluate the options. Within 24 hours, those words leaked to the Italian press, igniting a media inferno. In Formula One, evaluation is rarely introspection, it is execution. Inside the factory, loyalty fractured. Some feared the loss of identity. Others craved the order Horner could bring. Elkann, watching the division unfold, reached his own conclusion. If Ferrari could not reclaim authority from within, he would import it, even if it meant detonating the structure that had defined the Scuderia for 75 years. For John Elkann, Christian Horner represented more than a potential team principle. He represented a philosophy. Where Ferrari had long glorified passion, Horner had weaponized precision. His legacy at Red Bull was not merely the 8 driver championships and 6 constructors' titles, but the culture that produced them. Under his leadership, development cycles were synchronized to the hour, communication chains ran vertically without politics, and performance reviews were measured in milliseconds rather than emotions. To Elkann, that was the missing blueprint. The Scuderia's downfall was not resources, it was rhythm. Ferrari's engineers were brilliant but disjointed. Their simulations, world-class but siloed. Every upgrade of the SF25 arrived 2 races late and 3/10 short. Horner's method, streamlined, data-driven, and ruthlessly pragmatic, had turned Red Bull from an energy drink marketing experiment into a modern dynasty. That transformation fascinated Elkann. In private discussions with Vigna, he pointed out that Red Bull's success rate on major aerodynamic updates exceeded 80%, while Ferrari's sat below 55%. That statistical chasm symbolized everything wrong with Maranello's process. Horner's appeal was simple. He built systems that outlasted drivers. He made the team itself the star. For Ferrari, a brand addicted to hero worship, that shift would be seismic, but necessary. Yet the potential union carried a dangerous contradiction. Horner's greatest strength, total authority, was also what made him divisive. At Red Bull, his control was absolute, but at Ferrari, power is shared among executives, engineers, and politicians in red suits. The question was not whether Horner could win there, it was whether Ferrari could let him. Still, Elkann believed the reward outweighed the risk. With new engine regulations arriving in 2026, the sport was entering a technical reset that could erase years of disadvantage overnight. A leadership change before that moment could determine whether Ferrari reclaimed dominance or repeated decline. Horner's availability, combined with Vasseur's stagnation, felt like fate converging at exactly the right or wrong time. Elkann saw it as destiny's window, a chance to swap sentiment for structure. But he also knew that if he opened that door, one man inside Ferrari might walk out, and his name carried more power than any chairman's decree, Lewis Hamilton. Lewis Hamilton's arrival at Ferrari was never just a transfer, it was a statement. When he signed the contract in early 2024, it symbolized the convergence of 2 legacies, the 7-time world champion joining the most storied team in Formula One history. But that partnership was built on one foundation: trust in Fred Vasseur. Their relationship dated back nearly 2 decades to Hamilton's junior years in Formula 3, when Vasseur's quiet mentorship shaped the driver's discipline and strategic clarity. Hamilton's decision to leave Mercedes was not driven by money or marketing, it was driven by belief. And now, that belief was collapsing. Inside the paddock, whispers grew louder. If Christian Horner joined Ferrari, Hamilton might walk away. Motorsport journalist Will Buxton even suggested that Hamilton's contract contained performance clauses that could allow an early exit if leadership changed. Whether that claim was true or exaggerated, it resonated with insiders because it made emotional sense. Hamilton's loyalty is personal, not corporate. To him, racing is a human collaboration, not a bureaucratic ladder. Horner's history with Red Bull, especially the long-standing rivalry with Mercedes, added another layer of tension. For Hamilton, it would mean joining forces with the man who spent years orchestrating his defeats. Sources close to the driver hinted that he viewed such a scenario as spiritually impossible. The dilemma left Ferrari cornered. Replacing Vasseur might restore structure but destroy unity. Keeping him might preserve stability but guarantee stagnation. And beneath it all lay the marketing calculus no executive could ignore. Hamilton's brand power, valued by analysts at more than €50 million in annual global exposure, was irreplaceable. Losing him would not just weaken Ferrari on the track, it would wound its identity. Inside Maranello, Elkann's advisors quietly modelled both outcomes: keep Vasseur and risk mediocrity, or hire Horner and risk mutiny. The simulations did not predict victory either way, but in Elkann's mind, one truth had already crystallised. If Hamilton's legacy demanded stability, Ferrari's demanded transformation. And somewhere between those 2 legacies, a fracture line was forming, one that would either split the Scuderia apart or redefine its future before the 2026 reset. Inside Ferrari's boardroom, the debate over leadership had become less about emotion and more about arithmetic. Replacing Fred Vasseur before the end of his contract in 2027 would cost Ferrari an estimated €12 million in compensation, an amount that, on paper, seemed extravagant, but in Formula One terms it was the equivalent of a single front-wing development cycle. To John Elkann, it was a price worth paying if it reset the team's trajectory before the 2026 regulation overhaul. His argument was simple. The cost of keeping the wrong leader was far greater than the cost of replacing him. Ferrari's win probability models, updated after the Singapore Grand Prix, projected less than a 10% chance of victory in any of the remaining races and only a 4% likelihood of finishing second in the Constructors' Championship. Those numbers framed Elkann's conviction. The team was no longer competing, it was surviving. Christian Horner's record at Red Bull stood in violent contrast. Over 19 seasons, his leadership yielded a podium in 69% of all races entered, a consistency that Ferrari had not matched since the Jean Todt era nearly 20 years ago. Statistically, Horner turned turbulence into trend, but risk extended beyond contracts and data sheets. Horner's arrival would trigger a cascade of political consequences within Maranello. Senior engineers loyal to Vasseur might resign. Hamilton's inner circle could push for an early release, and Italy's tabloid press would devour every whisper. Yet to Elkann, doing nothing was no longer an option. The SF25 was a symbol of stagnation, a car overbuilt in simulation and under-delivering on asphalt. Even Ferrari's title sponsors had begun expressing private concern about image decline, with one global partner warning of brand fatigue in internal correspondence. For Elkann, the calculus had shifted. The decision was no longer about protecting reputations, but preserving relevance. And if that meant detonating comfort to rebuild conviction, so be it. Because in Formula One, fortune rarely favours the loyal, it favours the ruthless. And John Elkann, for the first time in his tenure, was ready to be both ruthless and remembered. What began as a leadership debate soon turned into a quiet civil war within Maranello. Ferrari has always been as much a political organism as a racing team. And now every department, from aerodynamics to strategy, found itself choosing sides. On one end stood Fred Vasseur's loyalists, engineers who valued his calm communication and his rare ability to shield them from the corporate storms above. On the other end were the pragmatists, executives aligned with John Elkann and Benedetto Vigna, who believed only an external shock could revive Ferrari's competitive heartbeat. Behind the scenes, text messages, internal memos, and late-night phone calls painted the portrait of a fractured organisation. Some staff openly feared that Christian Horner's arrival would impose a British managerial style that clashed with Ferrari's deeply Italian identity, while others quietly welcomed the prospect of discipline after years of improvisation. The tension reached a peak when financial officers demanded contingency budgets for leadership transition, estimating that relocating key personnel and rewriting technical contracts could cost up to €25 million over 2 seasons. For Elkann, these figures were the cost of cleansing inefficiency. For Vasseur, they were proof that the knives were already drawn. Even the drivers felt the divide. Leclerc, ever diplomatic, avoided comment, but those close to the team noticed his growing frustration during simulator sessions, where he complained that development feedback was circling rather than advancing. Hamilton, meanwhile, withdrew from most internal meetings, leaving his performance engineers to relay instructions indirectly. The mood was unmistakable. Ferrari was fighting itself more fiercely than its rivals. In the paddock, rival team principals observed the turmoil with curiosity and a hint of relief. One Mercedes insider described it as the most expensive identity crisis in Formula One history. And perhaps he was right, because while Ferrari debated leadership structures, McLaren and Mercedes were already finalising their 2026 chassis programs. Every week spent on politics was a week lost on performance, and deep down, Elkann knew it. The clock was not counting down to Horner's arrival, it was counting down to irrelevance. The question was no longer if he would act, but when. In Formula One, regulation resets are lifelines disguised as deadlines, and for Ferrari, the 2026 overhaul represented both salvation and judgment day. The new power unit formula, 50% thermal efficiency, 100% sustainable fuels, and a greatly expanded electrical deployment window, promised to compress the performance gap between teams. For most constructors, that meant opportunity. For Ferrari, it meant ultimatum. Every department inside Maranello knew the calendar. 12 months to finalise the hybrid concept, 9 months to lock chassis geometry, and 6 months to synchronise engine and aerodynamic packaging. Yet, as rivals progressed methodically, Ferrari's design office remained paralysed by politics. Engineers hesitated to commit resources, unsure whether they would still have jobs by the time the prototype reached the wind tunnel. One senior technician described the atmosphere as a team designing 2 cars and believing in neither. The development lag was measurable. Internal performance simulations leaked to Italian media showed Ferrari's early power unit model producing 9 kilowatts less peak output than Mercedes' test bench data and 4 kilowatts less than Renault's latest hybrid cell. Even McLaren, once trailing, had already completed 2 full-scale correlation cycles in Cologne's facility, while Ferrari still debated concept philosophy. Elkann interpreted those numbers as a countdown clock ticking louder with every delay. His board presentations began including a single slide titled Day Zero, marking January 1st, 2026, the day Ferrari's next car would either redefine the brand or bury it. Christian Horner's availability only intensified that deadline's meaning. If Ferrari hired him before year's end, he could influence development direction, supplier selection, and management restructuring in time for the new rules. If they hesitated, his expertise could end up at Mercedes or Aston Martin. The clock was moving faster than the politics. And as the final quarter of 2025 approached, Elkann's dilemma sharpened to a single choice: risk disruption now or accept defeat later. Because when the grid reformed under the new regulations, history would not care who stayed loyal. It would only remember who adapted. And for Ferrari, adaptation had never been optional. It was overdue. By the autumn of 2025, Ferrari's crisis had evolved beyond underperformance. It had become a referendum on identity. The question haunting Maranello was no longer whether the team could win, but whether it still knew how. Inside the executive suite, John Elkann faced a paradox that every leader in Formula One eventually confronts. Stability breeds loyalty, but only chaos breeds change. Christian Horner's candidacy crystallized that paradox. Hiring him meant detonating decades of internal hierarchy, alienating traditionalists, and risking the departure of Lewis Hamilton. Yet it also promised to rewire Ferrari into something it had not been since the early 2000s, a precision machine unafraid of self-examination. Elkann's advisors presented models projecting the long-term impact of both outcomes. Keeping Fred Vasseur yielded a projected 14% probability of winning a race in 2026, while appointing Horner raised it to 32%, numbers built not on fantasy, but on efficiency metrics drawn from Red Bull's historical development patterns. Those probabilities, modest yet meaningful, framed the most consequential decision of Elkann's career. Beyond performance, the optics mattered. For the first time in years, sponsors were whispering about withdrawal clauses tied to competitive benchmarks. One major partner from the luxury sector reportedly told Ferrari's marketing division, "Consistency is our currency, yours is fading." The pressure extended beyond the garage to the shareholders, the fans, and the media that made Ferrari not just a team, but a religion. Elkann knew the symbolism of his next move would ripple far beyond the paddock. To replace Vasseur with Horner would signal that Ferrari had abandoned sentiment in pursuit of structure, that it had chosen system over soul. And yet, perhaps that was precisely what the Scuderia needed. Because the truth was undeniable, emotion had built Ferrari's legend, but emotion had also shackled it. The team that once defined excellence now defined expectation. The breaking point had arrived, and the next signature on Elkann's desk would determine not just Ferrari's trajectory, but the competitive landscape of an entire sport. For if Christian Horner did walk through the gates of Maranello, Formula One itself would never look the same again.